Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Our event will start promptly. Feel free to type in the chat your greetings, your name, which city or country you're listening from, and your native languages if you have any mother tongue other than English. The chat will be where you can type in your questions later on, but will remain hidden during the talk. Good afternoon to those on the West Coast, good evening to the East Coast, and good morning to everyone in Asia. Salam. The time is now 8:33 in Hong Kong, where I am hosting from, and my name is Tiff Chan. On behalf of Save Cantonese, I will be your host for today's talk and facilitating our Q&A section afterwards. And co-hosting with me is one of the founders of Save Cantonese, Jamie Tam. Would you like to say a few words, Jamie?
Hello, everyone. 大家好. 我係珍怡, Tam Zhenyi. I'm Jamie, and I'm one of the founders of Save Cantonese. We're very, very pleased to have you. So thank you for joining us for our first event with some featured guest speakers we're really excited to learn from today.
Thank you. A bit of background info about the organizers, Save Cantonese. We are a global community-driven movement and with Team Cantonese volunteers from across the US, Canada, in Hong Kong, and Singapore. Our organization was first launched in 2019 at Stanford, and we are joined by our sibling organization at CCSF with a shared goal of promoting and sustaining Cantonese language and cultural preservation. Since then, our movement has expanded to encompass broader efforts that keep Cantonese language instruction alive and ensure access for communities worldwide. You can find out more about us on savecantonese.org or follow Save Cantonese on IG, Twitter, Facebook. If you'd like to join Team Cantonese, we are always welcoming new volunteers. Now I'd like to introduce you today's distinguished speakers, Dr. Stephen Krashen and Dr. Nooshan Ashtari, both from the University of Southern California, Rossier School of Education, renowned linguists and education policy advocates with fields of research spanning heritage language acquisition, neurolinguistics, the role of virtual reality in language pedagogy, and many other related fields. Today, Dr. Krashen and Dr. Ashtari will present a broad overview of heritage language development, including its importance, flaws, and how heritage languages are currently taught, and methods for encouraging effective language learning. Please save your questions until the end or type them in the chat, and we can return to them at the conclusion of the talk. Without further ado, Dr. Krashen and Dr. Ashtari, welcome, and please, over to you.
Okay, I'm going to begin by answering a question that I'm sure is on your mind. What is going on with my bookcase behind me? How come there are no books there if I'm like a college professor and a scholar? Well, when you get to be my age, that's going to happen to you. You're going to try to give your books away. So my books, if you want to find them, they're spread out in public libraries throughout Southern California and in a few little free libraries. That is so cool. And my goal is that someday the whole thing will be empty, and that's going to take a long time. What I'm going to do in this brief section is I want to talk about language acquisition in general, and I'll tell a few stories. And then we're going to bridge over to heritage languages in general. I'd like to begin with a story about what is going on during the pandemic and what's going on with me. I have been home. I tell people I'm home alone with my girlfriend, which is really cool because we've only been married for 55 years. So we're still having a really good time. What I've been doing with my wife and I, we've been, having a good time watching TV, all this stuff and films. But also I've been doing other things. Tell you a little bit. I've been practicing the piano, not just playing the piano. It's really interesting. And as you can tell, I've been pumping iron, okay, at home. And I'm also working on my languages. Here in Southern California, I've been working on Spanish. Now, Spanish is not my best language. It's like number 4 on the list. But I'll tell you how it started. Friday mornings at the supermarket, Ralph's is the one closest to me, there's a special time for old people. You have to be 65 or older, and I qualify easily. And I went there the first time at 6:30 in the morning on Friday when the store was nearly empty. I got my groceries, took them to the checkout counter, and my checkout guy, a friendly guy with his name, it was Fidel. So I made the accurate guess that he was Mexican American. So of course I spoke Spanish to him, even though I'm not very good. He answered in English, of course, which is what they're told to do. And I was ready. I said in Spanish, I said, Fidel, tú puedes ayudarme, you can help me. Me metes de hablar español como ustedes. I want to speak Spanish the way you do, which is true, exactly. He really liked that. And we've been speaking Spanish for the last year and a half, once a week. I become a celebrity at Ralph's Supermarkets, okay? Fidel says, this guy speaks 52 languages, actually, not that many, but people come up to me speaking strange. It's a lot of fun. It's great. Fidel is wonderful. Anyway, in the beginning, it was just ordinary conversation. And now the word in Spanish is charlar, which means gossip. We talk, if you don't have anything good to say about someone, come sit next to me, okay? That was Theodore Roosevelt's daughter who said that. It's wonderful. So we've been doing that. And I'm getting better, no question. He speaks more rapidly to me. My Hispanic friends, I occasionally speak Spanish to them. They say, Steve, you've gotten so much better. What's going on? It's not from talking to Fidel. I only talk to him for maybe a minute or less because he's checking people out. He's got work to do, quick conversations. I've been going home and I've been taking the advice of our colleague Benico Mason, and I've been reading lots and lots of very easy Spanish, what we call graded readers. I have read authentic Spanish. It's a struggle. So I've been doing lots of easy books. I've got big piles of them. That's why I'm getting better. I am not getting my errors corrected. I'm not studying grammar. I'm simply chatting with Fidel. That's really it for maybe 5 minutes once a week or less, and reading these books. The good thing about the books, and I'm going to make this comment later in another context, they're slowly becoming literature. They're getting better and better. They're getting more and more interesting as authors improve in this area. Now, that has helped me a great deal in my language, just reading. I want to tell you how I learned to actually start speaking Spanish. Dr. Ashtari and I have a mutual friend we greatly admire, Jeff McQuillan. And Jeff McQuillan was my student. I was the master. He was the student. Now he is the master, and I am the student, Darth Vader, all that. Jeff is wonderful. He's a former high school Spanish teacher. So when I got interested in Spanish, I asked him, I've had maybe 20 hours of classroom Spanish. I asked Jeff to record little things for me. I'd record him. I call this narrow listening. Questions that I'm interested in. The major question, do you drink coffee? How many cups a day? Is coffee good for you? Is coffee bad for you? Do you play any musical instruments? Which ones, etc.? And the advice I ask all Mexicans, Cortez, was he a good guy or a bad guy? Because there's a mixed opinion on this. If you were going to acquire a language, what would you do? What is your advice? And my favorite, do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in unidentified flying objects, ovni in Spanish? I get this. I ask the same questions to maybe 20 different people. I have recorded them and I've played them over and over again in the car, and I'm interested because I know the people. That has helped me enormously. I have not gotten better in Spanish through study. Oh, I had a triumph in Spanish yesterday. This is the ultimate. We went to the car wash. You can get a car disinfected. We did that. It was worth it. Anyway, the guy at the car wash, I spoke to him in Spanish. We joked around. We had a good time. He didn't say, your Spanish is good. He just answered me, and we had a real conversation. To me, that is the ultimate when they don't notice or say anything. Anyway, it's all come not through study, but through comprehension. Comprehension in the little tapes orally, and comprehension of what I've been reading. And that has been the result of the last 45 years of research. We acquire language when we understand what we hear, when we understand what we read, When we have input that's so interesting, you forget that it's in another language. And that's happened to me in reading and in listening. That is not only one way of doing it, I'm beginning to think it's the only way. And a particularly pleasant way of doing it is fiction. Fiction used to have a bad reputation, but we now know fiction is where it's at. Fiction gives you the language you need. It even gives you a great deal of the academic language you need. And it gives you knowledge of the world. I'll tell you only one story and you'll be able to relate to it. About 25 years ago, I was drafted for jury duty here in Malibu. And when I got there, they immediately elected me foreman of the jury because I'm like a college professor. I'm supposed to know these things. It was a really difficult case and I didn't do a good job. I see later, tell you how I discovered I really blew it in many ways. Then about 10 years ago, I listened to John Grisham, The Runaway Jury. And I realized how much I had missed, how I could have done a much better job. Turned out to be a hung jury, and I blame myself. If I had known what was in that book, justice would have been served, no question. We get so much from fiction. People who read fiction know more. So another reason why I'm enthusiastic about it. Heritage language, brief introduction. The typical case of heritage language, which many of you have experienced, a child born in the United States, the parents speak another language. The first couple of years, they talk to mommy and daddy, they answer in the heritage language, then they go to school, and English absolutely dominates. By the time they're in junior high school, they can hardly talk to their grandparents. This is the problem we're facing, and I think we have a way around it. I'm really excited to talk to you about this because I think it's an area where we can make rapid progress using very pleasant methodologies. The methodologies that work are much more pleasant than the ones who don't. Okay, why should we worry about it? Heritage language, only advantages, not disadvantages. I'm quoting the words of Jim Crawford. Both Dr. Ashtari and I have been very impressed with his statement. There are only advantages. If you develop your heritage language, what do you get? Cognitive development. You know this. Heritage language speakers are intellectually superior, right? I didn't say modest, I said intellectually superior, okay? If you compare people with similar backgrounds, one develops the heritage language, the other one doesn't. The one who has developed the heritage language does better in school. Economic advantages. Famous quote, what's the best language for a business person to know? The language of your customer. And studies, Joshua Fishman has confirmed this. And of course, when you have the heritage language, you have more sources of wisdom, not just from the big culture, but from the family. Many, many sources of wisdom. You profit again and again. Disadvantages, none that I can see. This is win-win, folks. We've got problems. And I think we've taken big steps toward identifying them, and we can take steps toward solving them. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Ashtari and let her tell us about what some of these problems are. Nooshan Jan.
Thank you so much, Steve John. Absolutely. So one of the most dominant problems when it comes to heritage languages across the board in so many languages. I focus mostly on Farsi, which is my native language. I was born and raised in Iran, then moved here for grad school. But across the board in so many languages, we have data from Japanese, Korean, Cantonese, Mandarin, Spanish, all these different languages in terms of heritage language, is that heritage language classes are very, very actually not helpful at all, in some cases harmful when it comes to heritage language acquirers. We have quotes and data from so many languages about this. I'm going to actually read one of them about Farsi, and I think some of you might be able to relate to this, and we've heard it in so many different ways in so many different languages that it shows that they're not really helpful. So this is one. One of the participants of the study said, I spent about less than 6 months in one heritage language class and I hated it. It took up my Saturdays, all my friends are playing. It actually pushed me away from even wanting to learn Farsi. And we have anywhere from a few months to years and years of heritage language classes that have not been helpful. And some of the adjectives that have been used to describe this classes, I'm not going to read any more quotes for you, but these are some of the adjectives. Daunting, impossible, very formal, not interesting, tedious, waste of time. And the list goes on and on. And we wanted to see what the underlying reasons for using these adjectives and these horrible experiences are. And it turned out that the traditional methods of instructions were used across the board in these languages. So a lot of these language classes were not only on, late afternoons, evenings, after school hours. The kids are already tired. Now they have to take these classes, but they also relied so heavily on grammar instruction and vocabulary list memorization that these kids would go in, then they had to study more and more for something that they were not really connecting as much with either. And it ended up pushing them away even from wanting to acquire their heritage language, and the methods of instructions did not help with learning or acquiring the language at all at the same time. One more problem in this regard is the reactions of fluent heritage language speakers or native speakers of these heritage languages. Dr. Krashen actually wrote about this years ago, I think in 1998, this concept of language shyness. So what language shyness refers to is when heritage language acquirers can speak the language, but it's not perfect. So they have a few errors here and there, for example, in my native language, and I'm sure in many of the languages that you all might know. There are two different versions of formal you that you use for people who are older than you or have higher status than you, and an informal you that you use with your friends or people who you're more friendly with. And if, for example, these heritage language acquirers used one of the yous that they shouldn't have used, they get very bad reactions. They say they're not respectful to people, or if they make very, very tiny little grammar errors here and there, the reactions that they get from people, from native speakers of those heritage languages is very different from reactions that, for example, a second language acquirer might get when they speak their second, third, fourth language. And for some of us, for example, English is my non-native language, is my second language, we kind of can relate to that, because when it comes to English, and especially with immigrant populations, a lot of times perfection is expected. You have to, if you're in an academic setting or a work setting, if your English is not perfect, then or like, oh, I can't understand what this person is saying. Versus, for example, when the second language acquisition for fun, you're traveling, you're just learning the language for fun, people are much more open in regards to how they react to you. And that is something that affects language acquisition so much that we actually take for granted of how important those reactions can be for heritage language acquirers. I'm just going to go over one or two more quotes about this concept so that you can see how these reactions actually affect heritage language acquirers. There's this one about Farsi. It says, it's a tug of war. I feel like my parents want me to speak Persian, but then they turn around and criticize me when I'm not perfect. And then you go to a Persian mehmuni, which is the word for party. And then the older generation, they kind of look down on you and it feels horrible. So you can see that this is actually something that completely shuts them off from wanting to acquire their heritage language. Here's one from Spanish from one of Dr. Krashen's research. It says, I began to realize as I spoke Spanish to my relatives, they would constantly correct my grammar or pronunciation. My relatives would say, you would never know that you are the daughter of an Argentine. Comments like these shut me off completely to Spanish. So all of those corrections, they might be there might be very well-meaning of, oh, I want to help you, but in fact, what they do for heritage language acquirers is that it actually pushes them away. And correction in general, when it comes to language instruction, we really emphasize in teacher training that don't overcorrect. Corrections only for something that is repeated many times. And if and in general, it's okay if you don't correct at all, because language acquisition has to follow its own flow, and it's okay to allow for silent period. Everyone has their own silent period. For some people it might be shorter, for some people it might be longer. And one of the studies that Dr. Krashen did, I think the title is Down with Forced Output, of not forcing people to speak when they're not ready. And it's totally okay, especially for heritage language acquirers, to hear the language. So speaking to the kids, the children, or even adults in the language, if they understand it, and they will understand it, and not expecting them to absolutely respond in the heritage language, because once they've acquired the language, once they're getting a lot of comprehensible input, they're going to speak when they're ready, and they're going to be able to function in the language. It's just that they might not be ready for the output. Another thing is club membership. When it comes to heritage language acquirers, a lot of these children are not connecting as much with their heritage languages. So one of the things that we should do is that actually create those connections of having those good feelings, good associations with the language and culture, and all of these things of overcorrection, criticism, and the traditional heritage language classes are doing the exact opposite of that, of severing those connections with the heritage language that we want to avoid as much as possible. And I know, Dr. Krashen, you have a story about some of these in terms of the parking experience.
Yes, before the parking lot, I want to tell you something just occurred to me from what you said. I have two heritage languages, you might say. One is Yiddish, the other is Hebrew. Hebrew is from 6 months in Israel about 2 million years ago. And I can still, do okay with it. Nobody cares. It's the absolute opposite is what goes on in the United States. If I meet an Israeli and I speak Hebrew to them, they say, why are you bothering? Because most of them speak English better than I do. Okay. My relatives, I never have spoken Hebrew to my relatives, except the older ones, then it's Yiddish. And Yiddish is such a strange thing to anyone my age who knows it. You get no credit. They just are annoyed why anybody would bother. So this is quite a distinctive phenomena with mine, and not a problem, of course, but it is a problem with other heritage languages. I had a remarkable experience in a parking lot about 5 days ago, which really struck home. I immediately wrote Nooshan and told her about it. My wife and I were in a parking lot here in Malibu. We had just, got dinner somewhere, and we were getting into our car. And for some reason, I struck up a conversation with a young lady who was in her car next to mine. Where are you from? All that. And she said she volunteered that she spoke Vietnamese. And she said, I said, you speak Vietnamese? Yeah. And she uses it socially. She's born here. And she says her Vietnamese is pretty good. I didn't reveal my secret identity to her. We just had a conversation, okay? And I said, I do a little bit of work in this, and what we have found is that you get a lot of scolding from older people. She got so excited. She said, yes, that's the problem. I had no idea it was that serious. She went on and on about this. This is really much more serious. I'm one of the people who wrote about this first, as Dr. Ashtari told you. And I have not, then I wrote a friend of mine, Christy Lau knows her, Fei Shen, whose first language is Korean. I wrote her the other day. She said, you have no idea what a serious problem this is. When we get humiliation whenever we try, we're defeated if we do it, we're defeated if we don't do it. This is something that the only cure is if everybody understands how language is acquired. And this is where I have failed you in the last 50 years of research, because I haven't publicized it enough that it takes time and it takes input. So thanks for letting me go on and on about this, okay? I want to go from the parking lot to reading, which I think is part of the answer. I have been pretty much obsessed with this idea of reading, especially fiction. The great part of doing this presentation is I think we have the cure, and I think Dr. Ashtari has identified the barriers, and we can easily do something about them. And the great thing about the cure is that it's pleasant. It's not just reading, it's self-selected reading that you like, and that includes fiction. In fact, fiction might be the best part of it, the easiest. I'll give you a quick summary of the last 50 years of research. You get several things from reading fiction. This is popular fiction, magazines, etc. You get language. People who read more have better spelling, more vocabulary, write better. Every aspect of language improves from reading and improves a great deal, and it comes from fiction as well. Not only that, I'm pausing because I'm so excited. The more you read, the more you know. Like my story about being on jury duty. People who read fiction know more. Amazing study I just discovered about a month ago, Stanovich and Cunningham, done about 30 years ago. People who read a lot of fiction and magazines, who understand fiction, who know authors, know more in general about a wide variety of areas. They know more about history. They know more about geography. They know more about practical matters. They know more about science. How much fiction you read is a better predictor than high school grade point average. Reading fiction is better than study. Isn't that amazing? This is such pleasant stuff. There's a lot of stuff about kids catching up because of the pandemic. They've been home, etc. Get them a library card, turn them loose, and let them read a lot of, Sweet Valley High. I'll tell you about one study that Fei Shin did. I call it Sophia's Choice, a high school student, formerly and was a native speaker of Putonghua, but has become fluent in English. This is when she was in high school. In the high school she was in, she took a reading test when you come to school in the fall. Everybody did. Then in the spring, you take another one. Over the year, she got worse and worse and worse. Then she'd come back in the fall, she'd be better than she was the previous year. She made it up and more. What did she do over the summer? She went to the library. She read for fun. She read Sweet Valley High. She read Nancy Drew mysteries. She averaged 50 books for fun over the summer. Her mom, who was co-author of the study, said, my daughter is not really getting much out of school. Maybe we should let her stay home. So it's fiction that does this, that does this, this does this. We have a couple of very interesting cases of heritage language, one done by Lucy Say with Mandarin Chinese, and one done with Grace Cho. I like, they're both wonderful studies. Grace is especially interesting, in my opinion, because of the methodology, which I think is brilliant. Grace went to a party where there were lots of Korean Americans, as she is, okay? And she saw a lot of people at the party who had come to the United States when they were like teenagers or younger. And she was astonished at how well they spoke Korean, even though they had been in the United States 30 years on the average. Most of them were readers, pleasure readers, junk readers. One of them was an official translator, and it was all from the pleasure reading from the magazines, okay? So now we're so the answer is getting interesting books to read in the heritage language, and Nooshan will tell us why that's not so simple, why these great, easy things to read are not easily available, but we're going to change all that. Dr. Ashtari.
Yes, unfortunately, reading is great, but when it comes to heritage languages, especially in countries that don't have a very large population of heritage language acquirers. There are, or even countries where they do, there are not enough resources and reading materials for heritage language acquirers to use that are comprehensible and compelling to them. What we did was that we looked at Farsi in Los Angeles, which has the highest population of Iranians abroad. And it's gotten its nickname of Tehrangeles because of that, the capital city of Iran. And we looked at books that are available in Farsi in this area. So there are a few bookstores, Farsi bookstores in the area. I went in and interviewed all of the owners, and it turned out that the books that they have available are not even easy to read for native speakers of Farsi. So a lot of these books are political books and economic books and books of poetry, or very, very dense language books that even I would have to use a Farsi to Farsi dictionary to be able to understand. So very easy readers, graded readers, things that are going that with that I+1 or a little bit higher than their level of proficiency for language learners to be able to understand and go up and go to different levels, higher levels with. Those are not available for many, many heritage languages in general. And I'm sure that's also the case with Cantonese, all these other languages. So most of these books, not helpful, but also even the books that are available. So we looked through 72 branches of Los Angeles libraries to see if first of all, if there are any books available in libraries for these heritage language acquirers, and if they're helpful. It turned out that out of the 72 branches that we looked at their database, only 300 books were available, and we have about 2 million Iranians living in this area. So 300 books is very, very low number. And only 12 of those books were taken out at the time of the study, which was winter 2019. But you can see that even the numbers that are available, they're not helpful. Otherwise, more and more people would actually be using them. We also did this very, very interesting study. Dr. Jeff McQuillan that Dr. Krashen mentioned, the master, the student, all of the Star Wars aspect. He actually did this very, very interesting study using unobtrusive measures in qualitative research, which is a type of research method that you don't influence the data, you don't directly work with participants, and you kind of get some information indirectly. So for instance, this is the study that he did. He went to a library and he took out self-study language books in so many different languages. I think he did 6 different languages. Cantonese was one, Mandarin, Spanish, German, Portuguese, and Italian. And he looked at pages. If you go to any library or even the books that you have at home, you should be able to, you can kind of tell on which page you stop reading them or somebody stopped reading the books, because there's some sort of wear and tear, which they called in this study wear and tear index of, you can tell, for example, if there are any wrinkles, any smudges, coffee or tea stains, like the corner is turned a little bit. So you can actually tell on which page the book had been stopped, like the reader had stopped reading the books. And they looked at those books, and very interestingly, across the board in all of those languages, only 16.8% of these books were read. So that's, when you think about it, a lot of these books are 300, 400 pages. They're very thick books. And 16% of them is not even a chapter, or maybe a chapter and a half. So these books, at the end of the day, very similar to those traditional heritage language classes that we talked about, are not even helpful. What we have available is not even helpful. And as Dr. Krashen mentioned, fiction can help a lot more with language acquisition than any type of traditional materials that are available. We did this study with Farsi. We were curious to see what is happening with Farsi, and that number was even lower than those languages. So it was only 5% of the books. So the books that we got from the library, where there were a lot of Iranians living around that library, there were only 5% of those chapters or those books have been read. So maybe a few pages here and there. We talked about how there are advantages to heritage language acquisition across the board in so many different areas. We talked about some of the barriers and problems that we're facing with heritage language acquisition, but there is hope. And there are ways, there's a solution, there are different kinds of solutions that Dr. Krashen is going to talk about.
Okay. I want to conclude this with part of the solution that we as a group have been very interested in, and that is the potential of what is generally called light literature, comic books. I want to give you a brief history of comic books in the United States, because our Cantonese speakers, heritage speakers, are under the influence of attitudes toward comics in the United States and what the potential is, okay? And in the audience is someone who has explored this potential enormously, Christy Lau, and I'll just mention her work, and I hope you will have a chance to find out more about it because it's quite extraordinary in my opinion. Comics. I'll give you my history with it. When I was in the 3rd grade, I was in the low reading group, even though I grew up in a print-rich environment and all the advantages. My father brought home comic books and said, Stephen, you can have all you want. I'll pay for them. The rest is history. Within a month, I was in the next group up and the next group up and the next group up. And the next breakthrough happened with my son. When he was in high school, I had insomnia. I wandered in his room and I found this big collection of Marvel comic books. I was up all night reading Spider-Man comic books. They have become literature. Comics got a bad rap from a book that came out called The Seduction of the Innocent by Frederick Wortham. Came out about 30 years ago and said, comics are responsible for juvenile delinquency and illiteracy. The book is a mess. You know, the kind of evidence they had, they go to a little boy's room who was in trouble with behavior, and they found comics. See, comics caused the problem. Well, there were comics in everybody's room. In those days, 90% of children were reading comic books, okay? There's soap in his bathroom, obviously he's a problem. So it's that kind of logic. The public loved it. And we had the comic book code, which made it impossible to have an interesting story. Today, because of Stan Lee, in my opinion, and the Marvel comic book company, comics have emerged as literature. They are excellent. Not every comic, of course, but comics and graphic novels, they cause reading. I'll tell you about one study. It's called Spider-Man in the Library. They put comic books in a junior high school library and graphic novels, but didn't allow them to circulate. You had to go to the library to read it. They looked at behavior over 2 months. The number of library trips nearly doubled. More kids came to the library. The number of non-comic book material taken out went up 30%. Studies I've done with a true expert, 1st grade teacher, 2nd grade teacher, Joanna Gie. This was her dissertation. It was wonderful. Kids who read comics, even if they're high poverty areas, they read more than other kids. They read more than kids who have more access to books. It causes reading, doesn't stop it. So this, I think, will be the breakthrough. Nilda Aguirre, who's the director of the National Association for Bilingual Education, grew up speaking Spanish in Florida, but didn't have Spanish literacy, no bilingual ed. Her father started a pharmacy, Spanish comic books. The breakthrough was your friend and mine, Archie. She identified, she read all the Archie comic books, etc. Jughead is counterculture. Why did Archie prefer Veronica to Betty? These are interesting stories. Here's your homework assignment. You've got Archie comics at home, I know. Take out an Archie comic, color Betty's hair dark. She's Veronica. Okay, they look the same. Little personality difference, that's all. So I think this is the answer. Lots and lots of light literature. Don't worry, it's good stuff. It's going to promote. With Christy's study, Christy Lau's study, using comics as enrichment in Chinese in general, the excitement over comics is phenomenal. You see kids leaving class with tons of comics they want to read at home. The implication is gigantic. I think this is really a major, major, major breakthrough. Okay, we're going to leave some time for questions and answers. Okay.